Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining us tonight. We are so excited to be here with our Soho lineup for July. I'm Elizabeth from Mystery to Me Books, so excited to be hosting with you all. We are here with the lovely moderator, Katharine Beutner. She is an associate professor of English at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. She's previously taught in Ohio and Hawaii. She earned a BA in Classical Studies at Smith College and an MA in English of Creative Writing and a PhD in English Literature at the University of Texas at Austin. Her first novel, Alcestis, won the Edmund White Debut Fiction Award, and she recently received an award for the Ohio Arts Council Individual Excellence. She is the editor-in-chief of The Dodge, a magazine of eco-writing and translation, and we've recently had her in Mystery to Me to do a wonderful reading for her most recent book, Killingly. So, Katharine, if you want to take it away.
Yeah, thank you so much, Elizabeth. And thanks to Mystery to Me, of course, for hosting this event and for that introduction. And thank you to Soho for publishing all of our work as well as organizing this great event. So I'm going to start by giving some broad intro to just what the lineup is for viewers, and then introduce our two panelists tonight. And then I have so many questions that I want to get them talking about and talking about with each other. So just for context, for anyone who has not ever logged on to a lineup event before, this is a digital event series that's presented by Soho Crime and Mystery to Me that focuses on bringing Soho Crime authors in conversation with each other like this. So if you're interested in purchasing any of the books that you hear about today, please support Mystery to Me by buying them from them as our indie bookstore partner. And Kwei and Sam have also signed book plates for tonight's event. So if you buy a book from Mystery to Me, you can get a signed book plate. Along with it, there should be a green button that shows up for you below the panel for purchasing books. The next lineup event will be on August 20th at 7 p.m. Eastern as well. And that one will be a summer showcase featuring Michael Sears, Scott Phillips, and James R. Ben. So as we go through the event tonight, there on the right-hand side of your screen, there is a bubble, a dialogue bubble with a question mark in it. If you hover over it, it should say Q&A. And if you have questions for our authors, please put them in the Q&A box. I will check it throughout the event. And then at the end of the night, once we've gotten through our discussion, we will leave probably about 15 minutes maybe for Q&A. So yeah, please, we'll get to as many as time permits. Other quick reminder is that we will randomly select 3 folks who are on the call tonight to receive a Mystery to Me gift card at the end of the event, 3 different gift cards. So I will announce those at the end of the event at some point. So make sure to stay to the end to hear if you get a gift card. Let's see. Right. So let me first introduce Sam Bett, who is a fiction writer and a Japanese translator. Working with David Boyd, he co-translated the Mieko Kawakami novel Heaven, shortlisted for the International Booker Prize, All the Lovers in the Night, a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award for Fiction, and Breasts and Eggs. And our other panelist, Kwei Quartey, was born in Ghana and raised by a Black American mother and a Ghanaian father. A retired physician, he lives in Pasadena. He's the author of 5 critically acclaimed novels in the Darko Dawson series, as well as 3 other books in the Emma Jan series, including The Missing American, which was nominated for an Edgar Award for Best Novel. You can find him on X at Quartey Kwei, on Instagram at Kwei Quartey Author, on Facebook at Mystery Kwei, and on his website, kweiquartey.com. So I'm going to start with a couple of questions for both of you, and also feel free to talk to each other and not just me. But I guess the biggest thing, considering the topic of our panel being queer international crime fiction, what do you find most interesting or exciting about writing or translating queer international crime fiction? Feel free to
Okay.
jump in.
Well, to me, this is something really quite new. I've
Mm,
written quite a few stories set in Ghana, and there's always some sort of social and or economic basis as a backdrop, and sometimes it's a social ill or a phenomenon that is taking place in the country. I grew up there, and I keep track with all the goings on. And this one is so different for me because it's actually occurring contemporaneously with events in Ghana.
Yeah.
And of course, why it's so germane to me is, I'm a gay writer, and I'm also, an African American, son of an African father and American mother. And because I grew up in Ghana, which is always such a hospitable and warm and decent place.
Mm.
What's happening now across the continent of Africa as they criminalize same-sex relations is a deeply, deeply personal shock to me. I cannot understand what is going on. So this is the first time that I've written a novel in which I kind of feel like I'm in it rather than just at the
Right.
periphery,
Yeah.
observe. And but I also realize, what? There may be people out there who can relate to this. Geographically, it might be different, but this is happening everywhere. And
Yeah.
so it's something that I had to write. I just had to write.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Kwei.
Yeah, Kwei, thanks so much, and it's such a great introduction to your work for people who haven't discovered it yet, too. I'm coming at this conversation a little bit differently as a translator. I also write, but in the context of translating. I just wanted to show people Kwei's book since we haven't seen it yet. This is what
Oh,
this is what the
nice.
ARC looks like, right? So for me, just we're speaking generally still, we haven't really gotten into the books, but I don't know, like an interesting question because we're talking about crime fiction. In fact, the Soho imprint is Soho Crime, right? I just checked the spine to make sure.
Yeah.
And what Kwei just brought up is this idea of the criminalization of queerness, and it's a kind of interesting question of when we say crime fiction, what kind of crimes are we talking about? And we're usually talking about heists, like a kind of exciting crimes that maybe you would brag about, I'm not saying you wouldn't brag about being queer, but it's not the sort of crime you would want to be like, we're going to pull it off. You just want to live. So I don't know, I think a lot about sort of categories of, when we have a common word like violence, we have a common word like thriller, these are some words associated with the Night of Baba Yaga. And by Akira Otani, translated by me, not by me. But, when you think about violence, you think about thriller, when you think about crime, like these words aren't just kind of like, this big net that holds all kinds of crime, holds all kinds of violence.
Yeah.
I don't know. I was thinking of blood the other day and how certain circumstances of blood are kind of like legal in cinema and some aren't, like how we have blue liquid in feminine hygiene product ads, and then you can shoot someone in the face in like a PG movie, right? This is like really strange, but also I don't know, relevant, maybe cross section of our society. So those are just some opening thoughts. I guess the idea of queerness being criminalized is especially kind of maybe meta when we're talking about queer crime fiction, because there's more than one kind of axis of crime perhaps at play.
Yeah. And I was sort of, I'm a little hesitant calling my book, like a queer novel, because what it is, it's really a vessel in which queerness is embedded, and around it is all this other stuff. But you see, that's the way queer people live. They're always embedded in the majority population. And so in a way, my novel is a representation of what it's like to be gay in Ghana, and what it's like to be, I go deeply into the mind of, one of the characters, Jojo, who is gay and works at the same detective agency that Emma Jan works at. Only Emma knows that he is gay. And so when this murder comes up in which a young activist is killed, his name is Marcelo Tete, what complicates things is that Jojo used to have a relationship with the murdered victim, or the victim, and so now he's in a dilemma because if he steps away from the investigation, the boss is going to ask him why, and then he's going to have to come out to the boss, and he's afraid to. But if he continues in the investigation, then he is not a disinterested party anymore. He's not neutral at all. So he can't investigate, from an objective point of view.
Yeah.
But that's what living as a gay person is all the time. You see what I mean?
Absolutely.
Yeah, you've got to sort of blend in and then make your choices as to who gets to know and who doesn't get to know. If anybody.
Absolutely. I think I'm going to jump around a little bit in some of the questions that I had sent to you all before, because I feel like there's an interesting way to bring both of the books together in relation to what you two just said, which is that, Kwei, as in your novel, the violence that's being encountered is generally being, in this particular book, is being perpetrated against queer people, right, as an act of discrimination and hatred and threat. Whereas Sam, in the novel that you translated, our main character, at least for the majority of the book, Shindo, is violent herself. Like, it's her capacity for violence and her identification of herself as like a person. I'm trying to remember. She talks about sort of like the heat or the redness that sort of she always feels. I wonder if both of you could just talk about, like, since the ways that crime is being portrayed are so different here, like, how did you see, I mean, Kwei, for example, your book starts out with this very thoughtful note about, like, not necessarily not wanting to show too much violence because you don't want it to just be, a story in which we're just watching LGBTQ people be violently treated, but also wanting to really show that, like, this is what can happen, right? Versus, I think, Sam, in Baba Yaga, there's like I don't want to say a sexiness exactly, but there's like an appeal to Shindo's capacity for violence.
Yeah, well, Kwei, do you mind if I jump in on that?
Sure.
So just because, hopefully people are discovering these books for the first time, to give folks a quick summary of the Night of Baba Yaga. The main setup is that this woman, Yoriko Shindo, she is a quarter maybe Japanese, mixed race. We don't really get her whole genetic pedigree, but she was raised in Hokkaido, so she's a Japanese citizen, but is not ethnically like, someone who maybe looks Japanese, has red hair, has more curvy but very muscular physical features, is in incredible shape. Probably, I think she's 22 in the book, and she gets kidnapped or abducted, being an adult, by a yakuza clan who abducts her for the purpose of being the bodyguard to the daughter of the yakuza boss. So I actually prepared an infographic. I'm going to share it on paper. I don't know if I'm only seeing like a section of my camera views. So maybe I'll just like slowly scan. So you can see this Shindo lightning bolt, right? And the Nike is in the Pentagon. I'm not sure what that's supposed to mean. White shirts, those are like the cronies. They're just called white shirts in the book. And then Shoko is over here. So Shoko and Shindo, they both start with SH, but obviously there's no test. But the basic premise is there. And to kind of like loop back into our conversation, what I wanted to add just about the Night of Baba Yaga is that it is definitely an exploitation book, and I mean that in the cinematic sense of the word exploitation. I don't mean the characters being exploited, but as a film genre in the 60s and 70s, like, you were having these some sexploitation, blaxploitation. There are all these kind of neologisms, and the basic idea is that they would play into a audience appetite for a certain thing. Yeah. But then they were also kind of, if you look at it from a production standpoint, they were often these incubators for young talent, because the studios didn't want to have the top people doing these kind of, low budget B movie things. But you would wind up, especially in Japan, in fact, having people who later became like, prize winning maestros directing these early projects that were low budget and kind of crazy and breaking a lot of rules. And I think in American cinema especially, but also in the Night of Baba Yaga, which very much plays with the language of cinema and the tropes specifically of the yakuza cinema,
Yeah.
which is a whole genre like cowboy films in America is.
Mm.
Um, you're getting a lot of those kind of indulgences, and one of them is violence, right? And what's really interesting about violence in this book is that when we see men committing violence to each other, men punching each other, shooting each other, it's almost invisible. It's just kind of like a genre trope. But once women are doing it, it becomes somehow, I think, it feels more violent perhaps to some people, to some readers, or it maybe feels more like a topical point of the plot. But what's really interesting to me about the queerness in this book is that in my memory, maybe readers out there can correct me on this, but I don't remember any moments in the book where anyone is scared of being queer. And the queerness in the book is also pretty liminal and not like, there aren't like, queer sex scenes. I don't think there need to be. There don't need to be,
Right.
it's not, you don't need to prove it like, straight until proven queer or something. You do, I guess. And by you need to, I mean, maybe that's an expectation that society has for what makes something queer.
Sam, that's great. Yeah. Kwei, what about you in regard to this?
In regard to what? I lost the train of thought.
Well, I guess just thinking about how I mean, I guess what I was most interested in, reading your book as a writer was sort of what choices you felt yourself having to make in terms of what violence you were going to portray and what you weren't going to
Yeah.
portray.
Yeah. Well, to be honest with you, I think that the choices were made for me because what you read in that novel is actually what happens on the streets of Accra. And I have seen YouTube videos that show this. And so the only choice I had to make was how graphic to make it. So there's one scene that is taking place in real time. And then the others are, the violence is represented at post-mortem as one of the doctors is doing her autopsy. So that it's living through the violence that has passed. But the body is right here telling you what happened in the present. And of course, that's what's so interesting about forensic pathology. The body is telling you a story, even though the person is gone.
Right.
So in Ghana, where there's not a lot of, firearm violence, very little, very, very little, because it's so hard to get a gun. It's almost impossible. But the machete is the weapon of choice, and it can do horrendous damage, awful damage. And it's kind of, in a way, it's more horrific to be, slashed up than like shot once in the chest. It's just so, I don't know, there's something very visceral and, shuddery about it.
Sure.
And so in some ways, the choice was made for me. And I present it the way it would present. There's nothing made up about it. I very rarely make stuff up so that it would be more sensational, because what the sensationalism is already there. It's baked in. I don't need to do anything. And so I don't, and as I said in the note, in the note before in the forward, the preface, is that some of this might be very, very disturbing for the reader, and I warn the reader, because while I don't exaggerate violence, I also don't sugarcoat it either. So if you're gonna read it, get ready. One of my brothers is very squeamish, and he always asks me to give him the pages of where the bad stuff is gonna happen, so we can skip over. So, but yeah, that it's the violence is what is really what it is. And just to go back to Emma for a brief second, the backstory of Emma is that she wanted to join the Ghana police as a homicide detective, like her late beloved father. And when she got there, she discovered that no, you don't have a choice. You can't just go into homicide. So, and then she suffered a Me Too moment, was kicked out of the police force, and just by serendipity, she discovered this private detective agency called the Soho Detective Agency. And so in the first novel, The Missing American, she thought she was just going to be doing like simple cases, marital infidelity, background checks, and so on. But it turned out to be a full-fledged mystery, which she took on as a rookie. And so, over the arc of the 4 books, The Whitewashed Tombs being the 4th one, she has developed quite a bit. And I would say that in The Whitewashed Tombs, Emma is pretty badass. She's really come into her own. So, yeah.
Absolutely. Well, we certainly have, I think, Sam, your description of the Night of Baba Yaga as drawing on exploitation films makes so much sense. And we have female badasses in both of these novels. I guess maybe for both of you, Sam, in terms of translating, like there's some sort of shifting of gender roles and expectations. Obviously, some of it will be clear just from what we've talked about in terms of Shindo as a
Right.
female fighter. What did you feel like you had to consider in terms of translating when you're drawing on this exploitation, I guess kind of like universe of references in the US as well as in Japan?
Yeah, it's true.
What did you think about in terms of how Shindo was represented as a translator? And then Kwei, I'll ask you a similar question about characters you were representing.
Yeah, well, one thing I would say is that a sensitive translation does not necessarily result, or a sensitive translation process does not necessarily result in a sensitive product. Meaning that, like,
Yeah.
you can really be careful and think about, like, is this the right thing to do? And that doesn't mean that the final book, in my practice, that doesn't mean the final book is going to be, I don't know, like declawed or something. And I think it's really important to consider what the functional elements of a book are. And probably the most difficult thing about being a literary translator is that the cultural import of all kinds of things, I'm really making a big statement about culture here, but something that could hurt someone for their entire life might be a joke in another culture, and I mean, like, the same statement, right? So you can't just translate those things literally, but there are situations where you also can't really translate them kind of adaptively, right? So you have to sort of think about, like you might have like a friend named Gordo. If you grow up in Mexico, that might be your buddy's name. And like, you have to just decide, if you're a Spanish translator, like, do you call him Gordo, or do you like explain what this is? And it just sort of stuff like that. Like there's definitely some concerns about like how gender is represented in the book. And was that maybe part of your question?
I suppose I'm trying to not be spoilery as well about.
Yeah, no, you don't need to be.
Occur over the course of. Sure.
I think, sorry, there was a hiccup for a second, so I couldn't hear entirely what you said. But I will say that like the setting of this book it's like rooted. Most of the book, it takes place in the late 70s. So I wasn't alive then, but I also, this book was written, I think probably written in 2019 and published in 2020 or something like that. So there, basically, I mean, historical fiction evokes like a kind of, in America, that evokes like a kind of specific vibe, maybe like turn of the century, or like, I don't know, like colonial narratives or something. But it's written about the past, so you have to ask yourself, like, to what degree do I project my values onto this? Probably very little is the answer. And to what degree do the values of today belong in this story? And the answer to that is the degree to which the author has put the kind of values of today into the past. So anachronism and things like that are going to, come up. A lot of the time, the characters are going to sound, whether you try to or not, like 2024, just because it's really hard to write dialogue that sounds like the 70s without making it sound too groovy or something, too Annie Hall. But at the same time, every once in a while, I've translated some books that are quite older. I mean, not like hundreds of years old, but I have a couple of Osamu Dazai translations, and Osamu Dazai died in the 1940s. So for those books, if there's like slang going on, I do sometimes check to see, like, use etymology dictionaries and things like that to just verify if I'm like using a slang. I found out that sicko didn't become a word till the 70s, for example. So I didn't use that when I wanted it to. I found out that wannabe didn't exist till the 80s, sort of little discoveries. But
Yeah,
yeah, the finding a way to recreate the book in English. I mean, you're making up something basically, because
Of
like the book
course.
doesn't exist in English. It will never exist in English. So you're kind of creating this like this maquette that can then represent the book in English.
yeah,
I'm
that's
just burning with curiosity. How did you get into Japanese translation? I don't know. It's just like, man, I'm just thinking this guy must be extremely brainy because this is like incredible. How did you get into this?
Well, I there's definitely a long answer, and it just I want to make sure we have time for both of us to talk about the books. But the short answer, because I know there are people interested maybe in the topic that might be listening as well, so I'll try to answer for that audience and for you, Kwei. Um, at the beginning, I was really just doing whatever I could. I had the language skills because I went to the University of Massachusetts at Amherst and I learned Japanese there. I studied abroad for about 15 months as an undergraduate, basically like a year and a half. But the translation world this is changing, but at least when I really kind of like clawed my way into it about 10 years ago, it was pretty free form. There weren't a lot of models. There were a lot of tenured professors who were kind of doing it as a hobby, but
Mm.
the professionalization of it is still something that's in process, and that has pros and cons. The pros being that if you find something that works, people might look at you as if you invented something, but if you want to know how to do something no one's done before, like if there's something you wanted to serialize or some kind of unmodeled pattern, there's a good chance your editor has never done it before. There's a good chance your editor has never edited a Japanese translation
Right,
before, depending on where you
right.
are. So there's a lot of kind of uncharted terrain, and that can make it hard to make a living out of it because there aren't really defined patterns. But it can also make it easier to make a living because you can kind of decide, like, how do I want this to look, and if it isn't working, try something else. It's just a different way of, like, I don't know, homesteading or something. I don't know what the good metaphor is, but
interesting. Quite
Very interesting.
getting back to that question about characters, choosing how to present characters. Your novel has multiple perspectives, as you were mentioning earlier. So, how did you choose what sorts of lives you wanted to represent, both in terms of the LGBTQ characters, but also you have these right-wing evangelical Americans who are coming onto the scene with lots of force politically in Ghana.
Yeah.
Did you choose who you wanted to put in the book?
Um, well, of course Emma's established, and then all the other characters, all the other members of the agency are established, and they all have their personalities. So Jojo is very, very good looking and very young looking, so he can go on the cover as like a young person, or even high school he can pass. Um, Gideon is the IT expert; he can like dismantle anything, and then one of the last characters, Menu, is a sort of grumpy older investigator with like older ideas about
Mhm.
what's good and what's not good. And then the maybe even the greatest character is the boss Soa, who is a man who he's probably in his early 70s or so, but this is a very wise man, a very sort of fatherly man, and I think all the younger ones in the agency look up to him, um, just for his wisdom. So those are established. Now, when it comes to the other stuff, first of all, I need to make sure that everybody has a rich, rich, rich personality.
Mm.
It's like, I mean, it's not just that they're in they're in the book. It's that they have their own set of patterns of thinking and feeling, and so, for example, if you met one of my characters outside on the street, you would be able to say, "Oh, I know you," so that they're so sharply drawn. But at the same time, they're not all the bad ones are not all bad, and
Mhm.
the good ones are not all good. and because that's the way people are. So I actually love creating the kind of um, people that I personally wouldn't associate with in real life. I
Yeah.
just love, I love it. I just love, I even love to represent their sort of backward thinking on the page. It
Hmm.
fascinates, it just fascinates me. Like there was one scene in which Diana Cortland, who is the wife of the evangelist who comes to Ghana to sort of, sort of get legislation, anti-LGBTQ legislation into Parliament. And she sits there, the gorgeous blondness, and tells the wives of, the members of Parliament how, um, you know, there's a new process in which you make gay people turn into straight, by giving them a shock whenever they look at something of a gay man or something. It's like this stuff that was like given up, like, I mean, decades ago, and has been totally blasted. But she's going to sit there and just lie and
Hmm.
tell these lies that this is, and to me, it's kind of like fascinating that anybody would do that. And so, I don't particularly like Diana, but I sure like writing about her.
Yeah.
So yeah, yeah, I love making characters. I love making characters. Even the ones that like just make a short appearance, I like them to be something interesting about them. Like there's a minister, one of the elders in the Church of Latter-day Saints in the book. He doesn't show up very much, but when he does, he's got this shock of white hair, and in a way he can, and he's sort of very solemn and sober. And in a way, even though he's just there on there for like a couple pages, you don't forget him because he's this guy with a shock of white hair,
Yeah.
you know. So yeah, everybody needs to be as rich a character as possible. That's really how I choose them. Yeah, and sometimes they just pop up,
Yeah.
and
Absolutely.
you know that as a writer,
For
and
sure.
that they just like come up,
Yeah.
you know.
It's true. Kwei, can you say a little bit more? We talked about this a little bit in our radio interview this morning, but about what it was like to be writing this book as a similar bill was proposed in Ghana, and based on what you said this morning, I guess is still under discussion, has not
Yeah,
actually been
yeah,
finalized.
yeah. I mean, it's very interesting the way. Actually, once when I was in Ghana, I had a few radio appearances, a few interviews, and one of the interviewers asked me, he says, "Wait, how is it that when you live in the States, but how is it that you write these books about Ghana that are so topical? It's like it's as though you sort of know what's coming." And this is actually what happened with this because, in the last novel, Last Seen in La Paz, Jojo was introduced. Well, it was hinted at that he was gay,
Mhm.
and my editor said, "You know what? I think you need to run with that a little bit." And so I started thinking about that, and then it just so happened that right at that time, I heard about this bill being introduced in Ghana's parliament, which includes things like being jailed for 5 years if you are gay or found to be gay or accused. Don't forget, anybody can accuse you. It doesn't have to be proved.
Yeah.
You could still go to jail. And if you talk about, they say promotes gay activity or LGBTQ, that's 10 years. So, and you can't talk about it. So technically, if you're talking about it on the radio, you could technically be marched off to prison because you're talking about gay stuff. I mean, the whole thing is just so ridiculous.
Mhm.
And so as this came up, it was like, oh my God, I can't believe it. This is actually happening. And then I thought about all the people who have actually been victims of this of these vigilantes in the street.
Mhm.
And it's not that far from murder. If somebody hacks at you with a machete, you may die. And so this is what happened. Somebody got killed, and Marcelo Tete, his dad, came to the agency saying, like, I don't trust the police because they don't like gay people anyway. So could you investigate this for me? And that's how Emma came to be one of the investigator. And I tell you, there are so many twists and turns in that thing. My own head was spinning. It was actually quite amazing how many twists and turns came up that
Yeah,
I wasn't expecting. That was crazy.
absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. The book I'm working on right now is set in 1900 in the US and like not a vastly different environment in some ways, not so much with um, legalization or bills, but just in terms of the crimes happening against queer people, not exactly going to be a priority of the police force at that moment. So
Oh yeah,
I hear
no.
you. Absolutely. So I guess how did you I want to just ask one more question about this because I'm curious. Were there ways that you were hoping readers would either be able to learn about what's happening in Ghana specifically because of the novel, like ways that you are hoping that they might kind of be um, intrigued to learn more about the ways that American religious organizations have kind of gotten themselves involved in political movements in
Yeah,
Ghana and other African countries, of course.
yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, this is what I love to do, to bring stuff that people had no idea is going on. For example, the anti-LGBTQ movement in Africa, if you can believe it, it started as a collaboration between an American professor whose name was Scott Lively and Russians.
Mhm.
Now, Russia has some of the worst anti-LGBTQ laws and extreme violence against LGBTQ persons.
Yeah.
And they collaborated on this. And what's really funny is this language of, family values.
Mhm.
And like, for example, there's the World Congress of Families. Every time you hear family, you know what's going on. It's like, this is the promotion of the family, the mom, the dad, and the two cute little kids, and heterosexual all the way. And so, you know, Russia's language for these family values, and the bill, in fact, in Ghana is called Promotion of Proper Sexual. I can hardly even remember the name.
Yeah.
Proper human sexual relations and Ghanaian family values, or something absolutely recent. It's just so absurd.
Right.
Nobody can even remember the name. And the wording is actually, if you compare it to what they have in Russia, it's almost the same.
Yeah.
It's the same thing, family values.
Yeah.
And so a lot of these places, World Congress of Families is one. There's the American, uh, not the Heritage Family. There's American. I forget the name, but there's so many acronyms
Yeah.
of these people that are anti-LGBTQ. But the way they present it is protection of the family, the heterosexual, the heteronormative family, protection of the kids from being, in quotes, recruited, because
Mhm.
gay people just go around recruiting young kids, as you all know. So so as this is going on, I'm actually writing this stuff at the same time,
Yeah.
and it's actually evolving with my book. So in fact, even though the book is about to be published September 3rd, the actual situations, conditions in it right now are exactly like what it is in Ghana, because they haven't passed the bill yet.
Right.
They're waiting for the president's signature, and what he's doing, the president is kicking the can down the road because he doesn't want to sign it. He
Sure.
doesn't want to be the president who signs it. He's going to leave it for the next guy because this is the end of his term. So, yeah,
Interesting.
we're
Yeah.
watching it like unfold. As so. If you read my novel, you know what's going on in Ghana.
Yeah. Absolutely. I, Sam, to turn back to you for a minute, I
Wait,
wondered if
wait.
you
No,
could,
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Just,
of
just, just
course,
to inject one more little thing.
please.
All of this I always combine, with the cultural, quirks
Mm.
of living in Ghana. The little things like how you don't just say yes, you always say yes, please. Things like that. All those little things I love to put in as sort of the backdrop as well, so that people are not. I'm not preaching at people or giving them a
course.
didactic lecture. I
Yeah.
want them to actually enjoy it as well, while they're learning about this stuff.
No, I mean, that's my feeling about not just queer crime writing or historical fiction, but I think all the genre work that I find most exciting is work that is using genre structures to do other things as well.
Yes.
Be entertaining and also.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and I mean, Sam, I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about whether, first of all, Kwei was mentioning twists and turns, and obviously there's a big structural twist that I'm not going to describe that happens in Night of
Yeah.
Baba Yaga. And
Yeah.
whether there are any non-spoilery things that you can say about how you thought maybe as a translator, I mean, I realize you aren't necessarily shaping the structure of the novel, but you're still thinking about how it comes across on the page, what kinds of things you
Yeah.
wanted to do. I'd love to hear about that.
Well, yeah. So, thank you for that question.
Yeah.
I'm definitely not shaping the structure. So that's one of the variables that is not a variable. It's a variable
Yeah.
to the fiction writer, but not to the translator. A
Yeah.
lot of the variables that the writer has, like word choice, sentence order, even,
Hmm.
um, at the paragraph level, we do have a freedom. And then in the editorial side, this hasn't happened a lot lately, but there are times where there is editing, and like when I say editing, I mean like scalpel editing, right? So
Yeah.
if you're cutting like 3 pages, then you're definitely changing the order of things, just kind of like in that way. But the most I guess I would want to say about this book is like, sure, there are some nonlinear aspects to the book,
Mhm.
but I think the healthiest way to approach the translation process is to assume from the beginning that the novel has all of the answers that you need in it to translate the novel. That doesn't mean you are going to do it well. You need skill and experience, or you need at least gumption that will then lead to skill and experience.
Yeah.
But I think if you start in thinking that the book needs your help, then you're going to break things. And I don't mean break them in a cool kind of like, let's start a new world kind of, breaking old systems. I mean, like, there's going to be,
Mhm.
um, it would be like opening up a piece of electronics that you don't understand and just cutting
Yeah.
stuff. Oh,
Yeah.
I can just put a subcapacitor over here, right? But you probably can't. So a lot of the times I actually like translating the first draft without reading the book. I couldn't do that in this case because I was pitching the book, and I obviously needed to know the whole book before I could get someone to buy the project or
Yeah.
sign up for the project. But we don't have enough time to totally go into this, but I did something called a reader's report for the Japanese publisher. Hired me to do a reader's report, which is basically like a marketing tool that they could then use to try to place the translation via an agency. And in doing that, I took notes about like what was surprising to me, like where I didn't actually take notes. That's not true, but I noted, I mentally noted honesty. I noted where I was like, oh, okay. And even in cases where my first draft is also my first reading, people sometimes hear that and they're like, wow, but I think it's important to preserve the excitement of the reader. And
Yeah.
you're a reader initially as a translator, and you can only read a book for the first time once, right? So once you've read it before, no matter how exciting or interesting it is, like, you gotta wait like 10 years before you can be surprised by that shit again. You know what I mean? It's still
Yeah.
not gonna work. So that's what I want to say about that. I also want to say though that like one of the ways, I don't want to like steamroll queerness into this just like generic word for play, but one of the things about this book that I think it does do is it's maybe even queering narrative to some extent. So just
Yes.
putting that there
Yeah.
as like a question of like, hegemonic novel structure is its own oppression. And if you're going to have a book that doesn't play by those rules, but is also fully functional and healthy and makes sense and tells, and when I say healthy, I mean that like it has like an economical arrangement of parts that serve purposes and then result in a satisfying, entertaining finish.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I obviously both books I enjoyed very much, and I think structurally I was so intrigued, and I wish we could have a full spoilery conversation about.
Yeah, we could.
Yeah, we'll do it.
Yeah, I think readers will be able to just like figure it out as they go. You know what I mean? I don't think
Yeah,
it's,
but
and I think a lot of times if you have a conventional structure, you're almost like trying not to figure it out as you go. So
yes, that can be true too. Absolutely, for sure. Are there questions that you all have for each other as we have about 15 minutes left? We don't have any questions from readers yet in our Q&A, so I'm happy to take them. But I'd love to know if there's anything either of you still would like to talk about in our last couple minutes.
Well, for Sam, obviously the editing process is this kind of back and forth between the writer and the editor. Now, how does it work when you have translated a work and the editor doesn't know
the original? Sure, yeah.
Right. They don't know the original. So how do they, I mean, first of all, they have to trust you, right?
I hope
you've
so.
done a good job.
It's a real, it's tough when you find out they don't.
Change something, that might change the meaning and you see what I mean?
I do, yeah. So just really just like 30-second overview on this. Sometimes your editor knows the language, sometimes they don't. Sometimes the author is alive, sometimes they aren't. Sometimes the author is alive and is not a party to the editing process, and that is their call. Sometimes they are extremely involved. Sometimes they're very involved and they know English. Sometimes they're very involved and they don't know English, which is its own thing. So you use the word change, Kwei, and just in the interest of time, you're kind of changing everything, right? You have to change almost everything. I mean, in Japanese, we can't talk about the linguistic differences of Japanese and English, and they aren't the only two languages that are like this, but I know there's some translators in the crowd. And Japanese is different at a part of speech level, at a syntax level, right? And if the verb is coming, the fifth word in a 25-word sentence versus the first word, that sentence is going to feel very different if the action happens to be, telling someone to shut up or something like that, or telling someone I love you, right? If there's any delay, that's different. There are definitely things that are bigger differences, bigger changes, larger interpretations. And there are also things that just aren't possible in every language. So this has been abstract. So just to give readers or listeners a concrete point, there's a term of address in this book. If you recall, we have this graph here, right, where we have Shoko. She's the daughter. Nike's her dad, the yakuza boss, and Shindo down the bottom. Shoko is referred throughout the book as princess, and she's referred to, I guess, what's sometimes called vocatively. Like the case would be like, a form of address. Like if you called someone like buddy, right? It's used as like a kind of stand-in, or not a nickname, right? But like a title. She's not a princess, right? But the boss is really kind of like a regal, like kingly character. I don't mean in morals, but in status. And the word that is used is this word that kind of means like lady. And because of how lady has been used in English and its associations with like, being knighted and stuff like that, like it has all of these layers that don't really work in English. And they also don't bear repetition. So I had to come up with something else that worked, right? But like, she's not being called princess throughout the book. That's not what's happening. But she's being called something else. So I had to kind of come up with an equivalent that exists in English and that could be serviceable. So that's a pretty big change, right? But I didn't ask anyone's permission for that because my job is to actually do this exact thing. There are changes that, I mean, you could make a mistake throughout a book. Like you could consistently mistranslate something. It's kind of hard to think up an example on the fly. But the worst crime, not to overuse that word in a crime fiction talk, but the worst thing you can do would be to flatten something exciting, or to kind of bury an important, like a confessional moment or an insinuation that is supposed to be like a giveaway that someone is like showing desire or something like this. So it's really like elision or omission, that not elision because that would be maybe artful. So it would be omission that would be the kind of disastrous change in a translation, not like there's a possibility for an overblown, conniving, like, please slow down, buddy, don't do that kind of translation move. But people I don't know, that stuff stands out. And an editor who doesn't know the source language is going to see those things where you're like giving you're giving the Yakuza like Al Capone voice. Your editor's going to be like, please don't do that. But if you make the Yakuza like use a specific swear word that definitely doesn't feel like a Japanese swear word because, it feels very American or something, they might ask you like, hey, like what's going on here? Like, is this a, for example, word for
Yeah.
like a
Yeah.
woman's body part in the original or something? You know, our word like bitch, for example, is not maybe like a word for that in another language might have a totally different association,
Yeah.
might not be related to what that word is related to. So
Oh,
stuff
that's
like that, you know.
yeah.
I had
I'm going to
a
pause you. Kwei, do you mind if I pause you? We did actually get a reader question, so I want to
oh
be
good.
sure that I get both of you to answer it, and then we'll wrap up.
Yeah.
And Catherine Holm asked, "What was your favorite part of writing these current books?" Sam, translating in your case, of course.
Well, I'll let Quay go first since I just went
Yeah,
and I
sure.
didn't write this book.
So say repeat the question. What was the
What was your favorite part of writing this current book?
hmm that's yeah, oh, wow. There's so many, yeah, there's so many parts. But I think, but as I made reference to before, I love some of the parts I enjoyed the most was exploring the twistedness of some of these characters.
Sure.
One of the main themes that goes through the whole book is hypocrisy.
Mhm.
Hypocrisy. People who condemn, as you well know in this country, a lot
Mhm.
of times people who condemn same-sex relationships are involved in it themselves. And it's all, hush, 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 hush. And for me, one of the most fascinating things about people is how they can present an outward sort of elevated status. But meanwhile, in their bedroom or their home, they're down groveling in the mud, you know.
Mhm.
And I love talking about stuff like that. So, maybe even not even when I'm talking about Emma, I just love writing about these people who are not what you think they are. They're very
Absolutely.
twisted and something's going on, but nobody knows. Those are the parts I like the most. Yeah.
Great. Sam.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to love about this book. Like I said, I pitched it, which is I've worked on 17 books total. I've translated about 10 myself, not including
Mhm.
this one. 10 are out, but like I haven't really pitched that many of those. Only two or three. So it's not the most common pattern for me. A lot of books coming in are being proposed to me. Um, but the style of the book really stood out for me. And when I say style, I mean interesting sentence variety, surprising but also really natural word choice, really entertaining but also useful dialogue that like brings you through the story.
Yeah.
In terms of pointing out a particular plot point that I thought was really masterful, which is a little bit different than your question. Uh, this is a book about organized crime in a way, right? It's also a book about what does it mean to actually be a good person or a bad person and how much of each are in the other, which is something Quay talked about too. But something that I think this book does fantastically well is demonstrate how much organization is in organized crime, because it would be so easy to just have like this idea that like gangsters are just like fucking shit
Yeah.
up, like, breaking stuff and like,
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
clumsy or something. But like there's all of these really quotidian details in the book. For example,
Yeah.
Shindo is forced to sleep in a small room that is also where they store their ballpoint pens and their legal pads and their
Yeah.
tenugui, which is a type of cloth that you often give out for promotional reasons, right? Like this is a company basically. And
Yeah.
a lot of yakuza, this is not a joke, a lot of them have websites and like
Mm-hmm.
business cards and
Yeah.
organizations, right? The
Yeah.
Yakuza are very much involved in corporate contracts, in the construction and things like this.
Mhm.
So it's just like, I mean, the way that organized crime exists in different cultures is also different. In Japan, organized crime is it's intrinsic to the structure of organizations and even social organization.
Mhm.
So this is really at odds in a way with kind of like the sense of evil behind organized crime, because
Yeah.
it's almost like this, I don't know, social the glue, right? And the disorder or the chaos is coming from what feels more like the good guys, but those are also the ones that are committing probably volumetrically the most violence in the book. Maybe not the worst kinds
Sure.
of violence, but the most amount of violence.
It really struck me how much it seemed kind of like um I don't know, like the other male yakuza who are they're like living in a dorm kind of, and they're all like
Yeah,
time to go to the cafeteria for our
it's
meals,
a lot like the military.
Yeah,
Honestly, I wasn't in the military myself, but like the boys, they are young in this book, right?
Mhm.
Maybe they're like 16 to 20 or something.
Yeah.
And certainly, I think that there are people who glorify this lifestyle, but also like, people only have so many options. They're born into different situations. They might make mistakes. They might have difficult family situations, and you wind up in a situation where your best bet at power and stability seems to be being in this organization. And there's even a monologue later in the book that talks about this with respect to being a Zainichi Korean living in Japan, which is an ethnically Korean person living in Japan. We don't have time to get into that, but it does. The book does really get into this question of like choice and crime, which is kind of fascinating topic because it's not as simple as opting in, but it's also not as simple as falling into it either.
We have one more amazing question from a reader, which I'll have both of you answer real quickly, and then I'll announce who won some book cards. So for both participants, this is from Jose Rico. What kinds of quirks or meaty details have you decided to leave out or been asked to leave out of a novel or translation because it would require too much context for an American reader?
Oh, that's
Oh,
such a good, good, good,
It's a
good
great
question.
question.
Because what often happens is that I might introduce a phrase or a common expression from Ghana, and it makes absolutely zero sense to the. And sometimes I try to see how much I can get away with,
Of
but
course.
once the editor comes back with, "Wait, what is this?" I know no, this is not going to do. So,
Sure.
so like some Ghanaians might say something like, I was feeling some way." And then, what does that mean? That means I'm feeling weird.
Mhm.
So, if I put I'm feeling some way, it's like, what is that? What? So yeah, it happens so much in my writing. I'm sure it happens to Sam too.
yeah. I mean, the seemingly random, but I think topical example I give is that there's this whole tradition of post-war American Pacific theater films, right? Like films that have
Mhm.
Japanese characters, or also just like European theater films with like Nazis and stuff. They're all talking English because at the time people didn't want subtitles and they just wanted, but they're talking in English with German accents, right?
Right.
And the
I mean,
strangeness of
even in Indiana Jones, right? Like it
Indiana
survived
Jones,
all
right?
of that.
It's a
Yep.
way of coding. It's a way of signaling, right? Like so cinema it isn't real life. But an interesting thing about translation is that there are no accents, right? You don't have like I
Right.
am the only actor basically. I'm kind of like stage
Mm.
playing this whole thing, and it's not read aloud. So I don't have to deal with the accents. I don't have to address that. But like I need to figure out a way to convincingly, my idiolect of English is not universal. I don't
Sure.
sound the way that someone in India or like, South London or something is necessarily going to sound or think. So this is in a way rooted in American English interpretation also of the situation, but then this kind of, I don't know, attempt to make it generic and universal too. So
Yeah.
Jose, I didn't answer your question too specifically, but I do think sometimes stuff pops up like Kwei said, where it feels a little bit too I'm using this word intentionally, like native. People are like, what is this? This isn't like, and I fight for that stuff sometimes
Oh
because
yeah,
I want, there's a whole discourse and translation
yeah.
of doing this or not, as some of you know. And I like pushing the boundaries a little. And my sneaky way of pushing it more and more into translation is I try to render all food just using the word from the original language. Because if
Nice.
you Google that, you find a delicious picture. And if you Google like
Yeah.
vinegar rice cake or something, you're going to be like, I don't want to eat this. I never want to. I never want to ever
That's
even.
amazing. Sam, I have one tiny detail comment, which is that I remember in college reading a translation of Lysistrata, I think, where the Spartans were given Scottish accents to try to represent how they had accents in the original Greek,
Yeah.
apparently. Like their Greek was spelled funny to indicate that they were, I can't remember whose translation it was, but I remember being like, that is a choice. Thank you both. This was such a fun conversation. So let me pull up our winners here. It looks like we have Jose, who just asked that question, has won a $25 gift
Mhm.
certificate, Marilyn Levinson, a $50 gift certificate, and Don Schifrin, a $75 gift certificate. So I believe
Ooh,
you will be hearing from Mystery to Me and or Soho directly about those.
nice.
Thanks so much to everybody for coming, and thanks to both of you, Mystery to Me and Soho.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Catherine.
everybody.
Yeah,
Thank you.
have a great
Mhm.
night, everyone.